they're constantly talking about we have to fight Russia. You know, why? Why do we have to fight Russia? They're not the Soviet Union anymore. They're a fifth the size of the Soviet Union. They're not really a military threat to us anymore. We're in an era, it's controlled media. So what we're getting is probably not that closer to the truth than what they're hearing from Pravda in Russia.
Yeah.
It's coming from a really particular point of view. The military industrial complex. They make tremendous amounts of money off of war, and they have a lot of influence within the press, within our society.
If they were your neighbor, they'd matter, but if you were your family member, they'd matter
Oh,
more.
yeah.
But when it's out of sight, out of mind,
People don't understand how fortunate we are because most people in the world live in a system that doesn't give them much voice or economic possibility for movement. I think when you live overseas and you come back to the United States, of course, we have lots of problems. We always have things that we can improve and things that are kind of out of whack.
This is the Douglas Robbins Show.
welcome back to the program, everyone. I'm so excited to have this guy on today. His name is Ralph Pezzullo. He is a New York Times best-selling author and award-winning playwright and screenwriter. He is also the host of the popular podcast Heroes Behind Headlines. He grew up overseas in Mexico, Vietnam, Bolivia, Colombia, Guatemala, Uruguay, and Nicaragua as the son of a U.S. diplomat. His father later became the ambassador to Nicaragua. After receiving an MA in International Affairs from George Washington University, he started his career as a journalist for the Associated Press. His books have been published in over 20 languages and include Jawbreaker with former CIA operative Gary Bernson, and a series of thrillers called Inside SEAL Team 6 with Don Mann, who was a commando inside SEAL Team 6. Ralph has also written many plays, all of which have been produced in New York City. He has also written for television and film, creating screenplays and working with directors such as Oliver Stone, Antoine Fuqua, and others. His screenplay Flashback won the Best Screenplay at the New York Film Festival. He has 2 books coming out this year. Stolen Elections, The Plot to Destroy Democracy is due out in May, and The Great Chinese Art Heist is due out in July. We have a lot to cover today, folks, so welcome, Ralph Pezzullo. It is such an honor to have you.
Oh, thank you, Douglas. Thanks for having me. It's my pleasure.
Well, Ralph, like I said, we have a lot to cover, so let's just get at it, okay?
Okay, sure. Yeah.
So I'm throwing you a curveball to start.
Go ahead.
You obviously grew up in a lot of war-torn countries.
Mm-hmm.
How did that form your worldview and your view of the United States, its policies and influence?
Wow. Okay, that's a big one. So
I know.
Yeah.
I think you're going to start with a big one.
Yeah. No, for one thing, it makes you extremely grateful to live in this country. People don't understand like how fortunate we are because most people in the world live in a system that doesn't give them much voice or economic possibility for movement. I think, you know, when you live overseas and you come back to the United States, of course we have lots of problems. We always have things that we can improve and things that are kind of out of whack. But overall, we are an incredibly vital and a society that offers lots of opportunity to everybody with skills and energy and also another thing you learn from living overseas is that, you know, we have a certain way of doing things, and it's kind of what we're acclimated to, and just sort of assume that everybody in the world lives the way we do and thinks the way we do. And when you live in other countries, you learn that that's not true.
Right. You know what I've always found fascinating is other cultures because it really opens our eyes to
Hmm.
perspective, to how they do things, to how we do things. But um, I feel like it's so important for people to experience other cultures because it's so easy to have a myopic view
Yes.
of the world, and it's often very narrow-minded if you don't know other cultures or haven't experienced them.
Right. And I would say that that's the one thing that gets us in trouble all over the world is that we get involved in other people's business without understanding the history, the culture, the nuances of the language. And we often get involved in things with good intention and we end up making a mess because we don't understand what we're getting involved in. And I can cite many examples of that.
Uh, Go ahead. Let's
Well,
hear a few because
for
part of this
example,
con
my
the show
father,
is often.
I'm sure you
Go ahead.
remember President Aristide in Haiti. My father was President Clinton's what was his title, advisor for Haiti, and he got involved in a negotiation to bring Aristide back in power in Haiti. And
Hmm.
I told my father from the beginning, like, if you're going to get involved in Haiti, Haiti is a really unusual place. And you have to, if you don't understand the culture and particularly voodooism, you're going to be lost,
Hmm.
right? Because it has very particular rules. And my father, kind of went, oh, I don't have time for that. I've read some briefing papers and so on. So he got into this big negotiation between President Aristide and the military leaders of Haiti. It took place in Governor's Island. We're talking 1993. And they reached an agreement and it was signed, but it was signed on a Sunday. President Aristide signed it on Sunday, which is really important. Anyway, my dad and President Clinton and so on, they were all popping bottles of champagne, thinking that they'd made this great breakthrough. Well, I mentioned to him, I said, well, in voodoo, anything you sign on Sunday, anything you do on Sunday doesn't mean anything,
Hmm.
right? That's just one of
Well,
the tenets of
right.
voodooism. Like you can make any promises on Sunday, doesn't mean anything. Well, my father kind of looked at me like, what the hell are you talking about? And it turned out
Right.
to be true. So it really
Wow.
screwed up everything because the military leaders were pissed off that the Americans and the UN felt that they had accomplished something, and
Hmm.
they knew that because it was on Sunday, it was basically just kicking sand in their faces, you know. So so little things like
I'd
that.
imagine
Yep.
I'd imagine these type of events, nuance, has caused ripples throughout policies for decades that
Yeah.
just don't know enough about whatever X to
Right.
make real determination and real policy change.
Yeah, yeah. For example, another one is Afghanistan. Like I ended up writing a couple books about Afghanistan. And one of the things if you go to Afghanistan, if you kind of delve into the history and so on, you understand right away that Afghanistan is a tribal country. It's very divided, and people's loyalties are not to the central government, they are to particular tribes. Well, when we went into Afghanistan, we allied ourselves with minority tribes, the Tajiks and the Uzbeks. The majority tribe in Afghanistan are the Pashtuns. The Pashtuns are represented by the Taliban. The Taliban is sort of the radical side of the Pashtuns, but they are the majority tribe in Pakistan. So by in Afghanistan. So by aligning ourselves with the other tribes, right away we were kind of at a huge disadvantage, and seen as hostile to the majority of Afghans. And I don't know if a lot of American officials ever understood that, still to this day.
Probably not.
Yeah, yeah,
I mean, that's the problem is we're fairly isolated. I mean,
yeah.
that's an advantage,
Hmm.
but it's also there's a downside to that as well.
That's right. Hmm. Yeah,
And where do you get your news from, so to speak?
right. Well, exactly. So even like I was a reporter. Most reporters, they just sort of buzz in when there's a crisis to a country. They spend a
Hmm.
week or even a couple of days, they get the headline and they leave. So they're not really, yeah, that they're not experts. They don't really have that many contacts in a particular place. They don't know who to talk to. They're usually aggressively approached by groups with a particular agenda, and
Hmm.
it kind of you know has a big effect on the story that they tell, but it doesn't really serve the public, you know.
May I ask you something, Ralph? And
Yeah,
I know we're kind of
yeah, yeah,
veering into a
yeah,
different territory, but
yeah,
you're obviously a very knowledgeable man. Um, Leaving Afghanistan,
yeah.
it seemed to, this, we had been there decades, um, very, very long time, a
Hmm.
lot invested militarily, personnel who had died, obviously big money, behind it. Why did we leave it's in such a hasty manner? Or what, to me, or
Yeah,
what was shown to us was a hasty manner,
yeah.
you know?
Inexplicable, really. You know, when when Trump was president in his first term, he decided it was enough, that the United States had invested enough militarily in Afghanistan that it was time to leave. And he worked out a plan with it. They had negotiations with the Taliban, and they worked out a plan to leave, like an orderly plan, right? When Biden came into office, he kind of said, "Well, I'm going to leave, but I'm not going to do it the way Trump did." And he just sort of left abruptly, which was, really tragic. I don't know why they did it that way, but it was a disaster because they weren't able to get out the people that they needed to get out in a timely
Right.
way. So because, whenever we get involved in a country like that, and we had been involved for over a decade, you enlist a tremendous amount of local people to help you, interpreters, secretaries, drivers. Well, when the Taliban took over, all those people's lives were being threatened, and a lot of them were killed as a consequence. And it just ended up being this kind of scrum, this like very disorderly withdrawal, very desperate. And it didn't have to be that way. The biggest mistake they made is that they gave up control of the airport. So we could have held the airport until we got all our people out, but for some reason they said, well, we're just gonna, we're gonna let you take charge of it and just let get some flights out of there. And it was tragic.
Yeah, it seemed like,
And we left behind billions of dollars
right.
of equipment. We built bases all over the country. We just turned
Hmm.
all that over to the Taliban.
And all the relationships we built, we just severed it in an instant
Yeah,
and betrayed everything people had done for the last 10 plus years.
that's right. So the biggest dramatic example was the education of girls and women, which had been tolerated, during while we were there, and the
Hmm.
Taliban has come in and shut all that down. So it's terrible. It's terrible. I know
Really
there are still
unforgivable.
hundreds of thousands of people who are trying to get out, and
Yeah.
and where to, and the other part of it is that, you know, you can't just sort of write off part of part of the world and say, well, we're not going to deal with those people anymore. Um,
Yeah.
doesn't work that way. I mean, maybe 100 years ago it did, but not today. So we'll have to deal with Afghanistan in the future, whether they're a terrorist threat to us again or some other way. And it was a really bad decision.
And this kind of goes back to what you were saying initially about Haiti. Like, if we don't understand the culture and the nuance of the culture, things are typically going to go sideways.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, you're just not communicating um, effectively,
Yeah.
and other people, it's like anything else. If other people sense that right away, and the relationship gets off on the wrong foot. You know,
Well, it also leaves people thinking, did we even have a real relationship? Was there anything,
that's right.
you know,
Real. Yeah.
you
Yeah.
just assume it was not.
Yeah. Hmm. And
They were
my
just being
father,
used.
because of his career, he always liked to be in the hardship posts, like the places where there was conflict. And so from an early age, I saw this. Like, for example, we were in Vietnam from like 63 to 65, right
Mhm.
before, just as the buildup was starting. And
Yeah.
I was a kid, I was like 10 years old, but I could see right away, like, what the hell are we doing here? I mean,
Hmm.
I was actually the bat boy for the Special Forces softball team, and I was kind of their mascot, right? And these were the guys who were fighting in the north with the Montagnards and all this kind of stuff. They're out in the field. They were telling me back in 1963, hey, Ralph, this is not really a war we'll ever win. The people don't know what the difference is between the North and the South. They don't
Mm.
understand communism. They don't know what
Right.
democracy is. They've been rice farmers for, you know, hundreds of years. They just want to be left alone and not bothered, you know? And then we run in and we're like, oh no, we're Democrats and they're communists. And, we're talking about things that we understand, but don't really apply to the people. And again, we got ourselves involved in a mess and, terrible loss of life on both
Yeah.
sides. And, what did it really accomplish? Is the answer is nothing.
Right. Saigon fell. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, I guess maybe there were, and I'm just speculating. Was it, this was just sort of after Korea,
Yeah.
and they were, I guess, successful enough in Korea. They had established the South and the North. Maybe they were hoping the same thing would hold true there in Vietnam.
Yeah, there was this idea back then. What did they call it? Oh gosh, it was like, we've got to draw a line and stop the spread of communism, and
Yeah.
as though it was some kind of disease that was like spreading throughout the world, and I mean, yeah, I understand, the impulse to want to stop communism, but the way they went about it in like a kind of a territorial way in areas that
Yeah.
that that were where it really didn't apply, didn't make any sense. When I
Yeah.
was there,
And-
uh, there was a president, his name was Diem, who was sort of trying to make peace with the North, and the United States didn't want that.
Right.
They wanted to continue the war. And I remember my dad sitting around with, the New York Times reporters, and Walter Cronkite used to visit, and all these people, and they were basically talking about, we can't have negotiation with the North. They're communists. We have to oppose them militarily.
Mhm.
And it led us into that mindset, led us into a war. It was kind of inevitable.
And I'm guessing, as Eisenhower warned, that the military-industrial complex, obviously, uh,
Yeah, they
because
like
I
war.
think
They
before that it
want
was
war.
not
Yeah,
constant, right?
yeah.
Well, you need war to keep spending money on weapons.
It's a big
Um,
problem. I don't think people appreciate how critical it is. It's still with us.
yeah,
Um, and we have a president now who is, whether you like him or not, is trying to end conflicts around the world. And he's getting a lot of opposition, you know, because there are forces in our country that the military industrial complex, they make tremendous amounts of money off of war, and they
yeah,
have a lot of influence within the press, within our society, and they're constantly talking about, for example, we have to fight Russia. you know why why do we have to fight Russia? They're not the Soviet Union anymore. They're a fifth the
yeah,
size of the Soviet Union. They're
right,
not really a military threat to us anymore. Um,
yeah,
but they talk about it like it's still the Soviet Union. And you know, whether you like Putin or not, or it's just, they're constantly exaggerating the threat. And if we don't stop him here, he's going to take over Europe. I, I, it's all nonsense. It really is.
yeah.
You know,
A lot of propaganda. Yeah,
a lot of propaganda. People get caught up in it, and then the outcome is tragic. You see it in
yeah,
Ukraine. I mean, it's just horrible. Like the country is reduced in population by half. People have left. They've had tremendous, tremendous losses, and we still go around talking like they can win the war. I mean,
yeah.
they're not gonna. They're not gonna win the war. It's not gonna happen. And
That was the thing I'd never understood with I understand because NATO, and if NATO countries give whatever weapons so they can be offensive, then it's sort of dragging NATO in. But it's like you're giving enough weapons to defend themselves, but you're not giving them enough weapons to win the war.
yeah,
So
they
you're
don't have
just
the
kind of
capacity.
protracting it.
Yeah, they don't have the. They don't have. They just don't have the capacity to win the war.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
I mean, you can get into how it's started. We had a lot to do with it. Pushing them to join NATO when Putin was saying, "Hey, uh, I see them having NATO on my border as provocative." NATO was supposed to end after the fall of the Soviet Union. You promised it would end.
hmm,
President Clinton promised me, and
hmm,
here you are, and you're expanding it, and and from his perspective, it 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 makes sense, you know. But
yeah,
you've got people who want war. It's like we went to war in Iraq because of 9/11. There was no relationship whatsoever,
no,
none at all.
yeah, and the
Saddam
weapons of mass
Hussein
destruction
hated
and all that.
Osama bin Laden.
Yeah,
He was his enemy, and yet we made a crazy connection and made it sound like we had to go into Iraq and there were weapons of mass destruction, which everybody knew there weren't. And they
hmm,
sold that to the American people, and we invaded Iraq. And you go like, I've interviewed lots of people on my podcast who have, fought in Iraq, heroic, incredible people, but they all kind of realize it was in vain. You know, we didn't accomplish anything,
yeah, horrible, right? To
but
to have a brother
a
or
lot of people made a lot of money from it, and it
yeah,
seems so cynical that people could do that, but they do. You know,
yeah. Well, I was having this conversation with my wife the other day, and we can move on to your writing after this.
yeah,
But
sure,
if you think of someone who died in wherever, Africa or Russia or Ukraine, whatever, okay, you don't know them; it's sort of out of sight, out of mind. So it doesn't have that impact on you. So when you're someone who's just trying to make billions of dollars or whatever, You don't care about those numbers, those
Yeah,
casualties.
yeah,
You don't know the person. They're faceless, nameless to you. They don't mean anything.
that's right.
If they were your neighbor, they'd matter. But if you were your family member, they'd matter
Oh
more.
yeah,
But when it's out of sight, out of mind,
yeah. Well,
it has no impact.
that's the argument a lot of people use against the the profession having a professional army with no draft.
Mm.
So these are soldiers. They're mostly from the South. They're from poor backgrounds. They're not the sons and daughters of the elite or the media class or
No,
and
sir.
so it's very easy to just go, well, that doesn't really affect me. And
Right.
that's why Vietnam was different. During Vietnam, people were drafted, and there
Yeah.
was that immediately there was sort of a lot of spillback. People were going, hey, why are we doing this? You know,
Yeah.
there was a lot of protest from all segments of society because their sons and daughters were dying. That doesn't happen anymore. You know,
Yeah.
so
And then obviously, what is the motive? National security or national interest? And corporations are obviously very influential.
oh yeah, mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
All right, my friend, let's move back to
yeah,
you as the writer. I
yeah.
appreciate you, the conversation. You're obviously a wealth of knowledge, so I appreciate you letting me pick your brain a little.
Sure, sure. Happy, whatever. Yeah.
So, as a writer, I get this question a lot, so we're going to kind of take it down a notch. So,
Okay.
as a writer, people ask me this all the time. So, I will ask you,
Yeah.
how do you come up with the ideas for your books? And
Yeah.
secondly, what drives you to write these stories? Why do you care? Why should anybody care?
Um. Well, it sort of happens in two ways. It's either sometimes it's an idea that I have, which, for example, my book about that's coming out about the Chinese art heist, or people come to me with ideas or stories or experiences that they've had, and I decide whether or not I think they're important, and then I sort of dive in and try to tell the story the best way I can, and then get the book published and publicized and so on and so forth. So it's really up to me in terms of what projects I take on, um, which is great in a sense, but it's also like, you're kind of, even though you get some help from your agent and other people, you're kind of on your own in terms of marketing things and, finding the right publisher and so on. So it's an interesting field. It's extremely engaging, and I love it, obviously. But there's a whole business and publicity aspect to it that is not really writing. You know.
Right. You have to wear many hats for sure.
Yeah, and that's the part that I'm least interested in and probably the worst at. And
As
because
am
I
I. Yeah.
am like a creative person, um, but probably I have, more headaches on that side of the ledger than the writing part. The writing part is usually pretty smooth. Uh, it depends on the subject. Some are harder than others, but it's always, yeah, the part of finding the right publisher, publicizing it. That so that's always a challenge. No matter how, I mean, I've
Yeah.
written, I don't know, 5 or 6 best New York Times bestsellers. It's still difficult. It's always difficult. Every book is different.
Yeah. Understood. Understood. Um, and then one more question to follow up with. So, like, if struggling authors, they often ask, why does my story matter? Who cares?
Yeah.
Why should I write it? What would you say to them?
Well, I would say if it's something that you feel compelled by, that you feel that you have to write, um, then you should do it. Sometimes books are, it's a subject that is of immediate interest to people. and sometimes it takes years. I have books that when they came out, they were kind of disappointing, but they still sell, and
Mm.
constantly sell. 10 years, 15 years later.
Yeah.
So it's tricky. It's tricky, but I think my feeling is like if it's something that I feel has to be written, and a lot of times, my agent will disagree with me, and sometimes my agent will say, "Hey, I'm not, I'm not going to do this one, and you're on your own."
Mm.
And I've had situations where I said, "Okay, can I take it to another agent?" And they'll say, and my primary agent will say yes, and then sometimes I've sold it in 2 weeks later with another
Wow.
agent, for a good advance. So
Yeah.
it's a business that, there's no sure thing. Nobody really knows. Everybody's just sort of guessing on the marketplace and so on and so forth. So
Hmm.
I think you have to use your own independent judgment, you know, and you have
Hmm.
to
Hmm.
accept that, certain things are going to be more difficult for people to accept.
Right. Right. All right, Ralph. Let's get into your books that are coming out, my friend.
Yeah,
So
yeah, sure.
you have a book coming out in May called "Stolen Elections: The Plot to Destroy Democracy," and the
Okay.
summary is based on a 4-year investigation into election fraud by two top government whistleblowers, including CIA hero Gary Burnson. Their conclusion: enemies of the United States, including Venezuela, Cuba, China, and Serbia, have been determining the results of elections in the U.S. since 2006 through the use of electronic systems that they have developed. Using these systems, they now manipulate the results of elections in 72 countries around the world. Tell me more, please.
Okay. So what happened was last summer, a friend of mine was in town who's a DEA agent, and he said, I want you to meet a friend of mine who's sort of the most interesting person I know and has been like the best DEA source for years. This guy knows everything that's going on in like Latin America and the world. He's amazing. Anyway, I met the guy for lunch. Very interesting man. And I said, what are you doing now? And he said, investigating election fraud. And I was like, what? I mean, we've all heard about, Sidney Powell and Giuliani and all that stuff. And I was like, okay, well, what are you talking about? And he said, well, uh, what are you doing tomorrow? He said, come to where I'm staying, and I want to show you a presentation that we've developed that we've been showing members of Congress and FBI and CIA and so on. So I went to his place. It was a 5-hour presentation, very detailed. At the end of it, I was just completely blown away and kind of horrified. And I said, hey, how can I help? You know, how can I help you get this information out because it's very important? And he said, well, we
Yeah.
want you to write a book. So I wrote a book based on uh, what these investigators had found and what they had done. They were basically, like I said, government whistleblowers. There's a whole government whistleblower program that is very difficult to qualify for. And these guys were investigating the Cartel del Sol, which is the biggest transnational criminal organization in the world that is run
Mm.
out of Venezuela, run by the Venezuelan military, and control all drug trafficking in the Western Hemisphere and in Europe. They're
Wow.
huge. In the process of, when they do an investigation, and this is true for FBI or any other investigative branch, what you try to do is recruit sources within the criminal organization that you're trying to investigate, right? So what these guys did, they heard people kept sources that they were working with kept telling them about election fraud, and they were not interested in election fraud, but they kept hearing it. And finally they said, well, what are you talking about? And they started to, these are people that they had recruited out of the Cartel del Sol, Venezuelans. And they started to tell them about the system that had been developed by President Chavez. It's a long, complicated story, but basically in 2006, earlier, 2004, there was a referendum in Venezuela whether or not to accept Chavez's sort of program for Venezuela, and the polls show that he was losing. He was very close to the Cubans. The Cubans, he and Fidel Castro were very close, and the Cubans came to him and said, "Hey, buddy, you're going to lose the referendum, and that'll probably be the end of your power in Venezuela." And he was kind of like, "Yeah, I don't know what to do. We're running all these campaigns and so on. It's just not gaining traction." And they said, "Well, there's a new thing that they use electronic voting machines to do the tabulation. And maybe we can develop a program where you can manipulate the result of the election." So they hired 3 young Venezuelan engineers who had gone to very well-educated guys, and they developed a software. In the beginning, they didn't even have the machines. They used Olivetti tabulating machines from Italy and moderated them. But anyway, they won. They were able to electronically manipulate the vote. So it all looked very official in the final tabulation. And if you retabulated it, you'd get the same result. So Chavez was super excited by this, and he said, "Here's $2 million, $20 million, $200 million. Further develop this system, and let's try it out in other countries in Latin America." So they did, and they started. There were a series of elections in Latin America where leftists were installed in power. And they were all sort of surprising. Evo Morales in Bolivia and so on. And this system was so successful that he decided, let's try to migrate it into the United States. They've successfully done that. Every election since 2006 in the United States has been controlled by actors outside the United States. It's very hard for people to wrap their heads around this. But Trump wasn't elected in 2016. Hillary actually won.
He was not.
No, the results were manipulated. And Biden did not win in 2020. Trump won. So those are just 2 examples. But even municipal elections since 2006 have been manipulated in our country. The unfortunate part here is that the CIA heard about this program and adapted it started to use it themselves to manipulate elections in other countries in the world. And that's why it's been so hard to get anywhere with in terms of making people aware of this within the government, because you immediately run into opposition from important people within the government. Now it's all been verified. It is being investigated. There's a whole branch of the Justice Department that's working on this, and the book that I wrote is sort of explains how this whole thing happened. I had a publisher. It was supposed to come out before the election, but the publisher, I don't know, got cold feet. They were afraid they were going to get sued, and they've been delaying it since then. But it's coming out either the end of this month or early May.
Is it simply like a software program,
Yeah,
like
it's
a
a
virus,
software. It's
or
basically a very sophisticated software that has migrated, that has changed, um, and has basically infected every voting machine in the world. Uses the same software, and it's all controlled by. The results are controlled by Venezuela. Iran is a big investor in this system. China has put a lot of money into it, and the servers are in Serbia.
Hmm.
Huawei servers in Serbia. So the book explains how all this happened, um, and because what happened was, as I said before, they were these investigators. They're not election experts, or they're one's a former CIA officer. Um, but they recruited people who work for these companies, Venezuelan engineers who design the software. And these guys can tell you, like, I've interviewed. They're all government witnesses now. They're all in the controlled by the DOJ. But they can tell you, like like for example, the one of the first things they stole was the Democratic primary in Cook County in 2006, I think it was, and they were going to steal it for Obama, even though Hillary Clinton was way ahead. They managed to alter the result, and that started sort of the whole Obama campaign, where he surprisingly beat Hillary Clinton in Chicago in the Democratic primary.
I would think he would be. I mean, that's where he's from, but I would think he would.
Well, she was
He
very
would be.
popular at the time and much more
Yeah.
well known than he was,
Right.
and they manipulated the result. And the reason they do this is sometimes for money, and but the big uh, objective is basically to destabilize the United States, to make people question the whole system, and lose faith in our government. And that has been their objective.
Well,
That's
people are losing faith even without that, my friend.
Well, they contribute to it greatly, much more so
Yeah.
than people realize, much more so. Yeah. So
Is there
they're
no way of
behind. They're behind a lot of, like, Black Lives Matter. They're pumping money into lots of these causes through different NGOs. George Soros is part of this. He's allies with these guys. A lot of the disruption in our system is coming from overseas. It's not Democrat or Republican. They're really trying to divide us, and they've been very successful.
is it? I understand the election portion, but is it also through social media and all those outlets?
Hmm.
We hear of Russian bots and Iran. I've never heard of Venezuelan participating in this, but
Yeah.
um,
Well, Venezuela, as people don't, they sort of think of Venezuela as like, oh, another, banana republic. But Venezuela is one of the richest countries in the world. They have the highest oil reserves in the world.
right.
They make, and they run the Cartel del Sol, which makes like $1 trillion a year from drug sales. So they control all the Sinaloa cartel, all the Mexican cartels are really working for the Cartel del Sol. And the reason you haven't heard about it, most people haven't heard about it, is because they keep it out of the news. They're very powerful. They pay off people. They they've got there's been a collusion within our own government. Um, it's a really insidious thing. So right now, there's this whole debate about a Tren de la Ragua, which is a Venezuelan gang that Tom Hallman and so on are trying to get out of the country, and judges are stopping them. Um, this group is, they are like cadres. They are trained. They have a training camp in Venezuela, and they're sent into our country to disrupt things, to take over neighborhoods, to assassinate people, to commit arson. People
Well,
are not aware of how systematic this is. It isn't just a casual thing where you get a tattoo and you're part of a gang. They're trained, they're paid by Venezuela, and because the border was open, a lot of these really bad actors were allowed into the country, from Iran as well. And not to scare anybody, but we let down our guard. You know, we let down our guard, and we didn't take these people seriously. But
hmm
but now there are people in the new administration who have seen the evidence and are working to prosecute these people and end this. But it's a huge. Uh, I mean, it's a mind blowing situation. So that's that book. Yeah,
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 that's a
and it's
lot.
been.
That's a lot.
I mean, it's been a battle because yeah. I mean, for a while the FBI was after us, um, like because parts of our government were using this system for
hmm
their advantage. So they were protecting it, in other words. Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
I
but
guess if it's in your favor, you protect it.
yeah, I mean, right now it's thank God, uh, it's being quietly. Nobody's heard about this yet, but it is being um, investigated. People are being brought to justice, and it's going to become more well known, especially when the book comes out.
Oh, well, fascinating, a lot to unpack. But let me ask you one other question, then we can move on to the
Mm-hmm.
other book.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and I don't fully understand how social media networks work within, say, the U.S. as opposed to like a China that is difficult for people to get information into China or Russia or North Korea or something like that. What is the difference as far as how those programs are set up? Any idea?
Well, having worked in the media, I started as a reporter. Um, Unfortunately, over the last 20 years, the last 10 years uh, specifically, and more dramatically, reporting has changed. Journalism has changed. Um, it's these networks and so on are corporate controlled. It's very much what we hear and what we see is very very controlled. It's more like propaganda than it is news. Um,
Yeah, a lot of
when
it.
I was a young reporter, if I did a story, I had to have two sources that my editor could check. Like I would say, "Hey, this guy said he murdered this person," and my editor had to be able to call up two people and verify it. Right now, you see, in the last 5 years, 10 years, you see headline stories in the New York Times and the Washington Post and other newspapers, unnamed sources, no verifiable source. It's like, what is that? It's a rumor. It's propaganda. That doesn't count as real journalism, but it flies now. So it's much more like advocacy journalism, telling a particular story. And if you
Sure.
just look at it practically, well, these are people with, you know, big corporate machines behind them, and they're determining what we hear and what stories we hear. Right? Are they independent? Are they serving us? Are they really trying to inform us? And the answer is no. And most of the time they're trying to mislead us. So
Right.
I mean, it's terrible. It doesn't serve the American people, and it divides people. So you go on a news channel and they're all like screaming at one another, right? They never give you the context of the story. They never give you the facts, the background. It should be up to each individual to decide. Give us the context, give us whatever the problem is, lay it out in a fair way, and let people decide. Right? That's the way it should be, and
Yeah.
that doesn't hardly exist
They want
anymore.
to decide for you. Yeah.
That's right. Like even somebody like Joe Rogan, he, he's got his opinions and he's telling you his opinions. And it's like, look, you're a cool guy. Like your guest. I don't really want to hear your opinion. I want to hear what your guest has to say. The experts
Right.
have to say, and then I can decide whether or not I agree with them or whatever. But we're in an era, it's like it's controlled media. So what we're getting is probably not that closer to the truth than what they're hearing from Pravda in Russia.
Yeah.
It's coming from a really particular point of view. And I could just use the recent example of like Tren de la Ragua and MS-13. There are judges and there are people who are defending these people and saying we're not being fair by throwing, criminals out of the country. And, that's a crazy argument. You're not a citizen. You have
Right.
nobody, if I go to another country and I start causing trouble, they're going to boot me out, right? There's
Right.
not going to be any judicial process. And here you've got people arguing that we're not treating organized criminals fairly. It's just, it's kind of bizarre, but
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
And then you have a lot of
Right.
people who are just, they're not that well educated. They have opinions, and they're on one side of the aisle or the other side of the aisle, and the truth is always in the middle. The truth is always gray. It's not one side or the other. It never is.
Yeah. It seems with our Discord that facts seem less important than narrative,
That's
but
right. Yeah,
um,
that's a
you
good
know,
way to put it. Yeah, yeah.
well, a lot to unpack, and I did not know most of that, so I appreciate you illuminating
Well, I'll send you a copy of the
those
book
issues.
when it comes out. Yeah,
Thank you very much. I
yeah,
appreciate it.
yeah,
Um, so I don't want to keep you all day. So let's move on to the Great Chinese Art Heist. That seems to be a different direction
yeah.
for you. The extraordinary story of the theft of priceless Chinese antiquities around the world and the connection to crimes spanning 2 centuries with present-day implications. Seems like a different direction for you on this.
Yeah, it does, but you'll see it kind of ties in as well. In this case, I was approached by a publisher, apparently with a story. So starting in 2010, there were a series of very highly sophisticated break-ins at major museums in Europe, the Fontainebleau, and so on. And they would go in, thieves would go in, professional thieves, go through the skylight or, very sophisticated. Um, and they would go in and steal like 5 or 6 objects that were Chinese artifacts. They might leave a Rembrandt on the wall, which they've done.
Hmm.
And the investigators at first were baffled, like, what the hell's going on here?
Yeah.
And there were like dozens of these. It wasn't just one. There was a whole series, and then they captured a gang out of Ireland that had been hired by a Chinese triad. So a triad are Chinese gangs, that are very tied to the Chinese government, the Communist Party. And what they discovered, and what I explore in the book, is the fact that Chinese billionaires were hiring the thieves to break into Europe and steal back artifacts that had been looted during the Opium Wars of the 19th century. So
Well,
basically what happened in the 19th century is that, the West started to trade with China, and there was a huge trade imbalance because, we wanted it was basically the British and the French. There was a huge appetite for tea and spices and porcelain in the UK and France, but the Chinese didn't really want anything from Europe. China was a very sophisticated society, controlled the whole, Asian part of the world, a very advanced society. And the British came up with the idea of opium. They grew opium in India, which was another colony, and they decided, well, let's try shipping opium to China. Well, opium was kind of like alcohol is to opium to the Chinese, was like equivalent to selling alcohol to the American Indians. They just had a weakness for it. And within a short period of time, like 10% of the population was addicted to opium. And the Chinese emperor said, no, he outlawed it after one of his nephews died from opium overdose. And he said, I'm not letting any opium into China. Well, the British and the French fought 2 wars to force the Chinese to open their ports to opium. And in the last war, they just really humiliated the Chinese. They destroyed a lot of art. There was a huge palace outside of Beijing, which was like Versailles, and they completely burned it to the ground. And this has always been like a huge shame for the Chinese people. So basically what's going on now, the Chinese call it the century of humiliation, from 1860 to 1960, when Mao took over power. And they still teach this, and it's in all their textbooks. There are museums all over China that talk about the century of humiliation. So what's going on now is that the Chinese are saying, hey, we're powerful economically now. We're going to humiliate you. They call it unrestricted warfare. That's their theory. So the fentanyl, a lot of the stuff that they do is all part of that. It's like, we're going to take you down the way you took us down. And so it ended up I started it as just sort of like looking into these thefts and figuring out what was behind it. And it turned into a much bigger book because it all kind of ties in with this idea of, revenge. So they're taking their revenge. And I'll give you an example. There was a break-in in Norway for their like state museum, and the investigators were able to trace it back to Norway, to China, and the triads and the billionaires who hired them. And the Chinese were kind of like, well, so what are you going to do about it? And the Norwegians were kind of like, China is much more powerful than them. Trade with China they're very dependent on it. And so basically they just went, well, okay, we'll just forget it. And so it's a lot of bullying. It's a lot of, but anyway, it's just part of this whole movement called Unrestricted Warfare, and it explains, why they're exporting fentanyl precursors to Mexico, and it's killing like 100,000 Americans a year, and they're putting it in everything, and it's much more insidious and organized than people realize.
More fascinating stuff from you, Ralph.
Hey, man, I try to keep it interesting, you know?
Did not know all this. And, I think most people are obviously quite ignorant of when you peel back the curtain, so to speak, the forces at play.
That's right. That's right.
Um, you know,
And and they a lot of this stuff explains why we're feeling, weaker and and more division. There are bad actors out there that are, deliberately trying to undermine us, and we need to understand this. And I'm not saying go to war, but just basically say, hey, we know what you're doing. Stop it. You know.
well, let me ask you the opposing question.
Yeah.
Are we doing it to other nations?
Uh, I mean, we're, look, we're always up to, we've done a lot of bad things in the past, no question. But to completely undermine a society like this,
Mm.
that was never our approach. We were always, interested in promoting democracy and people who we determined were the best democratic leaders for a particular country, more superficial kind of stuff. This is really undermining societies and values and, pitting people
Yeah.
against one another. It's much more insidious and much more
Mhm.
effective. I mean, look at our society.
Yeah.
We're very divided. We're all kind of desperately trying to figure out what the hell's going on, and we're
Yeah.
we're picking up breadcrumbs because every story you read has a really strong agenda, one way or the other, and and our votes are being manipulated, and we don't know it. Um, so yeah, I mean, just another interesting sidelight on that. So the whole
Yeah.
Sidney Powell thing of the release the Kraken, remember that after the
Yeah.
2020 election, that came
Right.
from these two investigators. So they went to the Trump campaign in 2020 and said, "Hey, there was manipulation of the results in 2020, um, and we can prove that, but you got to you got to we need to investigate this because these are professional investigators." So they basically said, just keep your mouth shut now until we do our investigation and we can tie everything together. And what the Trump people did at that point was they were, desperate to get the story out, and they just sort of started shooting their mouths off without any evidence. So, but
Yeah.
they went to Sidney Powell and Giuliani and so on back then and told them what they had found, but they just said keep a lid on it, and they didn't. They went out right away and had, news conferences, and they didn't have anything to back it up with yet.
Yeah.
So it kind of discredited
I
the
mean,
whole thing. Yeah,
right, right, right. Um, yeah, it's easy to say things. It's harder to prove the,
that's right. And these
so
guys
many
are,
facts.
they're professional. They make cases that they take to the Justice Department, to prosecute. So everything has to be, lined up and proven and so on and so forth. So that they're very rigorous in that way. Because if they just make
This,
accusations, they don't get anywhere.
right.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, yeah. But the problem is people then parrot those accusations as if they're fact,
Yeah.
and then it just perpetuates these myths, basically.
That's
Let
right.
me ask you one other thing, and then we'll start
Sure.
closing up in a bit. But reminds me of, and this was before Dominion machines and all these
Yeah. Well,
electronic machines, was the
Dominion,
Bush
the two big
Gore.
companies are Dominion and Smartmatic. Yeah.
So the Bush Gore election,
Yeah.
right? It looked, and I'm maybe I'm not remembering it correctly, but it was down to there were the hanging chads and the counting the votes, and
Right.
it looked like Gore was going to actually win,
Yeah.
and the Supreme Court said, "Okay, enough, stop counting," and Bush won. I might be missing some pieces, but Do you recall? Do you have any information on
Yeah,
what
well, that
happened
was
there or
not
what
done.
transpired?
That was before the electronic voting machines. They were
Yeah.
introduced in 2006, but
Right.
it was also, really a dispute over what ballots qualified and which ones didn't. And the election was so close in Florida that it was only like couple hundred ballots. So it was really
Right.
about, had people, they were disqualifying ballots where people hadn't, they used to use punch cards, and,
Right.
some of them weren't punched all the way through. And that was like the hanging Chad debate. So they were debating over or not, whether or not, like clearly
Yeah.
a person's intention was to vote for a particular candidate, but they hadn't detached the Chad all the way. So it got into
Yeah.
this, you know, crazy debate, and it had to be settled by the Supreme Court. And that election in Florida determined the result of the net, of the electoral college, um,
Right.
and it had to be decided by the Supreme Court. Now, whether or not that was fair or not, I don't know, because you'd have to get into um, how they adjudicated, what was a, 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 a real intended vote and what was a mistake or so on. I mean, it got crazy. But in
Yeah.
terms of electric, you see, the electronic stuff is just all done um, by a computer through software. And having, studied this now, you talk to any expert and they'll tell you that there's no safe way to guarantee voting through computer software. There's always
Yeah.
backdoors. There's always ways to manipulate it. And so that's why
Yeah.
you hear Elon Musk and others saying, because he's read the book, saying, what we need to do is go back to, paper ballots and IDs, voter IDs. Yeah, which probably will happen. We'll see.
Much more intensive, but probably the only truest way to count
Yeah, I
presidents.
mean, we have to have the system has to have integrity. We have to be able to believe in accept the
Yeah.
result, and if not, we live in this world that we live in today. For example, in Georgia, the country of Georgia last year, they had a referendum whether or not to join the European, wasn't the Union, but what the precursor to the European Union. And the polls all showed that they were overwhelmingly in favor of it. Well, when they voted on Smartmatic voting machines. When the result came in, it showed that they rejected it. So the president of Georgia is a woman. She heard about us, our group, and she was like, can you help me explain what the hell? They were having riots in Georgia. Well, it turned out that um, our American embassy had pushed the idea of them using electronic voting machines. And, uh, there was a lot of collusion, purposeful or not, within our own government. A lot of the funding that USAID was giving out that was so controversial was promoting companies like Smartmatic and Dominion in other countries.
Mm.
Now, did they know systems were corrupted or not? I don't know, but it's very
Yeah.
suspicious. So it's a
Look, look,
uh, people are calling it the greatest criminal conspiracy in history. People who have seen it, at
mhm.
the top levels of our government.
Yeah. Let me ask you one more
Yeah,
question on this subject. So, Kamala and you had Trump,
yeah,
right? And Kamala would, didn't really win a primary, but nevertheless, let's move on from that part. But
Right.
so she was in the polls. She was doing great. She was this and that. She's going to win everything under the sun.
Yeah.
What happened? I mean, then she got crushed. So was it misinformation? What was it? The pollsters were wrong,
Yeah.
or was it a manipulation of the election?
Well, it was. First of all, the polls are not accurate anymore. They're run by companies who, again, are big corporate interests. They're not independent. So the polls were very inaccurate. They did try to steal the election for Kamala Harris. They tried, but as you'll read in the book, the same engineers that were recruited from Smartmatic and Dominion, the Venezuelans, through a system legally were able to block the servers in Serbia and prevent them from stealing the election.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a whole drama.
Fascinating and scary stuff.
Scary stuff. So they tried. They wanted Kamala to win. Now, who wanted her to win were the Chinese, the Venezuelans, the Cubans, the Iranians, our enemies, and they didn't succeed. So Trump probably won by a bigger margin that was even reflected in the results. Probably. Yeah.
Well, we'll never know, though.
We might know. We'll see what comes out of all these investigations. It's the guys the engineers who designed the system. They know, they can tell you each different, because there's like 3,000 voting districts in the United States, and there's about 15 to 20 that really determine the results of an election.
Right.
So that's where the shenanigans happen, and they can this stealing an election is planned like a year ahead of time. It's quite complicated, and they can tell you exactly, how a particular district was stolen. Because they can go back and there's like I forget the number, 14 backdoors into the system, and then they also do all kinds of manipulation with the voter logs, because when these companies come in and run an election in a particular district, they take control of the voter logs as well. So it's just a system that it was allowed to be corrupted over time. Earlier on, different congressmen and state governors and so on started to raise questions about the these machines and what these companies were doing, and they were basically shouted down, or people didn't care that much, but they've allowed them to like pollute our system.
I have a solution, Ralph.
Yeah.
I'm only half kidding, but get rid of the World Wide Web. Get back to more simpler times.
Let's do it, man.
It'll solve a lot of these problems.
Let's do it. Get rid of technology.
Go back. We'll go back 30, 40 years. We'll be all right.
Yeah. I mean, it's a blessing and a curse, right?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So the phones are great, but then everybody walks around watching, distracted.
Yeah, I know. So your podcast, Heroes Behind Headlines, what is...
Okay, so Heroes Behind Headlines, I have people, what I try to do is just get people, former FBI, former CIA, military. I've had victims of child trafficking, investigators, and so on. And I basically just, check them out to make sure they're legit, and then come on and tell their story. No
Yeah.
editorializing,
Love it.
and it's going back to the idea that we talked about before, where you're just hearing directly from people who had, have insight into certain issues and were, fought in certain battles or, investigated certain crimes. So they're just telling you their experience and
Yeah.
stuff that most people never hear. Like
Right.
this week, I have a guy on who was 87 years old. He's a CIA contract pilot. He was in Dealey Plaza the day Kennedy was shot,
Wow.
and saw, witnessed things that were, he reported to the FBI and the church committee and so on, and was completely shut down. But according to
Yeah.
him, the shooter was on the south knoll, not the grassy knoll, and he was where he was standing, and the shots came that killed the president, hit him from the front, came right over his head. So,
Yeah.
guys like that.
Yeah. Much. We were hoping when Robert Kennedy got in, he said, "Oh, we're going to release all the info about
Yeah,
JFK," and I know they said, but obviously there's
yeah. There's a whole
facts
story
that probably
behind
will
that.
never
I
be.
mean, I did a podcast like a year ago with a guy who was connected to Robert Kennedy's secretary, and you know, Robert Kennedy sort of knew immediately that there was a plot to kill his brother, and started
Yeah.
collecting evidence quietly. And when he died, the FBI, the authorities were really trying to get all this evidence from his secretary, who was,
Mhm.
keeping it hidden. So,
Right.
so yeah, definitely there was a plot to kill President Kennedy. Definitely.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Fascinating stuff. I've been speaking with Ralph Pezzullo, Pezzullo. You can find him on that website, and his book's coming out, Stolen Elections, The Plot to Destroy America. I'm sorry, to destroy democracy. That'd be a different title.
Yeah.
Stolen Elections, The Plot to Destroy Democracy is due out at the end of May. And The Great Chinese Art Heist is to be released in July. And his podcast, Heroes Behind Headlines, and he's got several other books out there. Ralph, has been such a pleasure getting to know you and speak with you today. Fascinating and scary stuff.
Hey, Douglas, my pleasure. Anytime you want to do it again, just let me know. Just trying to get information out to people and let them decide on their own whether they believe it or not.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
I got no agenda.
Yeah. And that's what we're all looking for. And I always come back to, we make decisions based on information.
Yes.
So if we have the wrong information,
That's right.
we're going to make the wrong decisions.
That's right. Now, and if you're being led and you don't know that you're being led to a particular solution, unless you have independent sources of information, how are you supposed to find out? And
Yes,
there's a lot of manipulation going on, and people, I think, are more aware of that than ever. But it's hard to wade through all the misinformation. And I, in my own small way, I'm trying to correct that.
Yeah. I agree. And the First Amendment was not designed to undermine the nation. That's
No,
for
it
sure.
was not. No, not at all. Yeah.
Ralph, has been such a pleasure.
Thank you, Douglas. Same here. Same here.
Be well.
Okay. All
Have a
the
good day.
best. Okay. Thank you.
You too.
This is the Douglas Robbins Show.